Okay, so to start it out, we're going to be doing some measurements. So I'm drawing in a dividing line right there that just divides the face in half, or the skull in this case, in half. So I'm trying to figure out what it looks like on the halfway mark. And then I just drew that onto the actual reference picture. Because if you know what the half is and what the length of the face is, you can get the width. I'm going to do this one more time where I'm taking it pretty much right where the eye socket is, the width at the eye socket. I'm pinching and I'm holding that measurement up against the actual reference picture, and it's a little bit more than halfway on the face if we're looking at it vertically. So that helps me because that means that I know what the measurement's going to be once I get the length of the head. So I'm just making up the vertical length of the head. But from there, I can divide that vertical length in half, and I'm using Vine charcoal to do this. I'm going to just divide that in half vertically. So you see it looks like a cross, so it's bisecting it horizontally and vertically in half. And oftentimes you'll see people who draw faces do this when they're first sketching out a face. It helps with the proportions. So right now I'm just going to get an overall gesture here of the face. That means the outline of the head, but very loosely, kind of geometrically when I'm doing it. I'm wanting to call it the face, but really it's a skull. So it's a face, but just removed of all the tissue and flesh. It is important to understand like the skeletal structure underneath what you're drawing anyway. So those of you who are interested in drawing people, it really helps to understand like the anatomy and the bone structure underneath. So now we're looking at the skull a little bit up close. I wanted to show you like the distance between the two eye sockets and how big those eye sockets actually are and how big that kind of bridge of the nose area is. There's a triangle that occurs between the eye sockets and that nasal passage. It's like an upside down triangle. It's really important that you get the nose high enough up because it looks different when you look at somebody's face and it's fully flushed out compared to the skull. The skull, the eye sockets, the nose, they're very close together. And they're this interesting triad that takes place. So you're going to draw that gesture of the eye socket. And it is important that you don't just assume that they're round because really the skull that we're looking at, it's not perfectly rounded. It can be a little bit geometric even, like it's a little bit boxy. I mean, you can kind of think of a pair of sunglasses because it's similar to that, but it's not as perfect as you would think. Use that bisecting line to make sure that you are even. So what happens on one side of the skull happens to the other, so it's a mirror image. Okay, so that's just the gesture of the eye sockets. Next, we're going to go to the nasal passage. So I'm putting in these guiding lines that are helping me to figure out where that top of that nasal passage starts, that septum. So it looks a little bit like an upside down heart, especially on the reference that we're using. And again, compare it to your reference, to your model. So I'm just putting down some measurements there because those eye sockets are pretty much halfway in the head, just as the eyes are if you're drawing a human face, they're about halfway in the head. If you take the eye line to the chin line and you divide that further in half, that's about where the jawline starts, maybe a little bit higher, but the tip of the teeth. If you look at the teeth themselves in the jaw, skulls have this look like they're smiling. And if you've never drawn teeth before, it can be a little bit challenging. You have to realize that the teeth recede and they're on this arc. So I'm dropping down a plumb line from that eye socket. You can see me do it on the reference just to figure out where the teeth start, because they don't start at the edge of the skull. They're a little bit more inland than that. You just want to make sure you're curving your line. You have an arc there. So on the teeth, the front teeth tend to be the biggest teeth, especially on this reference, and then the other teeth are overlapping, so they get progressively smaller, even though you know that the molars are going to be bigger or wider than the front incisors. And the bottom teeth are smaller, skinnier. And then make sure you bring that jawline in a little bit. There's kind of some edges to it. So I'm just going to add a little bit of shading to bring it a little bit more to life. And I'm just doing this with fine charcoal alone. You do have to pay attention to any place where there's an indentation or a hollow, because that's going to get dark. Or in the case of like the bottom teeth are kind of overshadowed by the front teeth because the front teeth are projecting out. So they're creating, like, they're blocking the light source. So I've taken some time off camera to start to fill some things in and to adjust the nose a little bit and get a little bit more detail. You can do the same thing. And again, I'm only using vine charcoal. This is just an exercise that we're doing. It does not need to be perfect. We are going to be doing the skull more in depth, so we will do that another day. This is just for practice to make sure we have the basic proportions correct. And you may choose to draw it from the side, or you may choose to draw it from like a 3/4 turned view. That's okay too. If you have extra time, you can do what I'm doing, and that's putting in some shading, so you have a little more going on in the drawing.